Elijah Walker has lived a quiet, predictable life, content as a high school history teacher and beloved community member. But when a routine grocery trip turns into a nightmare of wrongful arrest, everything changes. The revelation that his father was a legendary civil rights leader thrusts Elijah into a world he never knew existed. Now, faced with a legacy he didn't ask for, Elijah must confront his family's hidden past, a community still scarred by injustice, and a shocking betrayal that claimed his father's life. As the weight of his father's legacy bears down on him, Elijah is forced to ask himself, can he continue the fight for justice in a world still haunted by the very demons his father tried to vanquish? Or will he choose to walk away, leaving the past buried? In a story of identity, redemption, and the power of legacy, Elijah's journey will challenge everything he thought he knew about his family and himself. This is the Echo of Legacy, a tale of one man's quest for truth and the impossible choice that will define his future. The school bell rang, and Elijah Walker leaned back in his chair, listening to the familiar hum of his students as they gathered their things and headed for the door. It was the sound of another day ending. Elijah's favorite part of the day wasn't in the classroom. It was afterward when he could enjoy the quiet. The routine of life had always brought him comfort, something steady to rely on. "Mr. Walker, are you coming to the community event this weekend?" One of his students, Matt, called as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. Elijah smiled. "Of course. Wouldn't miss it." Matt grinned before hurrying out the door to join his friends. The classroom fell into silence, and Elijah sighed, looking out at the parking lot as students spilled out of the building, talking and laughing. He packed his briefcase slowly, taking his time as he went over the evening plans in his head. A quick trip to the grocery store, then volunteering at the community center for a couple of hours. His thoughts drifted to his mother, Ruth, as he locked up the classroom. She would be waiting for his usual Sunday visit, where they'd sit together in the old house where he'd grown up. They didn't talk much about the past. Ruth kept certain memories locked away, especially anything about his father. Elijah had long accepted that his mother had her reasons for staying silent. He had never pushed her to share more than she was willing to offer. Stepping into the warm afternoon sun, Elijah made his way to his car. Life was simple, predictable, and he liked it that way. The grocery store was cool inside, a welcome contrast to the humid summer air. Elijah moved leisurely down the aisles, picking up the items on his list: eggs, bread, tomatoes, and a few other staples. He liked taking his time here, relishing the calm before his evening at the community center. As he rounded the corner of the next aisle, he noticed an older woman struggling to reach something on a high shelf. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Ma'am, can I help you with that?" he asked, offering her a kind smile. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said, beaming as Elijah grabbed the can she was reaching for and handed it to her. "Happy to help," he replied before continuing down the aisle. These little moments made him feel connected to the people around him, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways. As he finished up his shopping, Elijah felt a sense of contentment. Life was good, steady and uncomplicated. He approached the checkout line, exchanging pleasantries with the cashier, who smiled at him as she scanned his items. Elijah liked being known here. He liked that this small town, where he'd lived his whole life, felt like an extended family. But as he pushed his cart toward the exit, something felt off. A low rumble in the distance caught his attention, followed by the piercing sound of screeching tires. Elijah glanced over his shoulder just in time to see 3 police cars pulling up outside the store, lights flashing. His steps faltered, and his heart began to pound in his chest. What was going on? The moment Elijah stepped through the automatic doors, a voice shouted, "Stop right there! Hands up!" Elijah froze. It took a second for him to realize the command was directed at him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. 3 officers had exited the cars, guns drawn, their eyes locked on him. "Put your hands where we can see them," one officer yelled, his voice sharp with authority. What's going on?" Elijah stammered, raising his hands slowly, confusion and fear building in his chest. "You match the description of a robbery suspect," another officer said coldly, stepping closer with his gun still trained on Elijah. Middle-aged black male, same build. Elijah's stomach twisted. There's been a mistake. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just shopping. He gestured to the cart in front of him, the groceries inside a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment. But the officers didn't listen. Before he could protest further, they rushed forward, grabbing his arms and yanking them behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and the weight of humiliation and disbelief hit him like a wave. I'm telling you, I didn't do anything. Elijah's voice cracked as he felt the stares of the people gathered around the store's entrance, some pulling out their phones, recording the scene. We'll sort it out at the station, one of the officers muttered as they pushed him toward the waiting patrol car. Elijah's heart pounded as he tried to process what was happening. How could this be real? How could this be happening to him? The door of the squad car slammed shut, and with it, the world as Elijah knew it. The police station was cold and sterile. Elijah sat in the interrogation room, his hands still cuffed, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the white walls. He felt like he was in a bad dream, one he couldn't wake up from. Minutes dragged by in silence, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps outside the door. Elijah's mind raced. This had to be a mistake. Any moment now, they would realize they had the wrong man. Finally, the door creaked open, and an officer entered, holding a folder in one hand. He sat across from Elijah, his expression serious but different, softer than before. Elijah Walker, right? The officer asked. Elijah nodded slowly. That's me. The officer opened the folder, glancing at its contents before meeting Elijah's gaze. We ran your identification. And, well, something came up. Elijah's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? There's no easy way to say this, the officer began, clearly uncomfortable. Your father was Reverend Samuel Walker. The name hit Elijah like a punch to the chest. Reverend? Who? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel Walker, civil rights leader. A lot of people around here knew him. You didn't. Elijah shook his head slowly. He'd never heard that name before. His father had been someone important? The officer shifted in his seat. We realize now that there's been a mistake. You're not the man we're looking for. We're deeply sorry, Mr. Walker. But, your father's identity, well, that changes things. Reverend Walker was a revered figure. We didn't know who you were. Elijah blinked, trying to absorb the information. His father had been a civil rights leader? Why had his mother never told him? His head spun with questions, and the apology from the officer barely registered. His world felt like it had just been ripped apart at the seams. You're free to go, the officer said gently. We're truly sorry for what happened. Elijah stood shakily as they removed the cuffs. But as he walked out of the police station, his thoughts weren't on the officer's apologies or the injustice he had just faced. All he could think about was his mother, and the secrets she had kept from him. The sun had set by the time Elijah pulled into the driveway of Ruth's small cottage. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, anger and confusion swirling in his chest. He had to know the truth. The door creaked open, and Ruth appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw him. Elijah, what brings you by so late, honey? But Elijah didn't return her smile. He stepped inside, his mind still reeling. I need to talk to you, Mom. Ruth's brow furrowed, concern flickering in her eyes. What is it? What happened? Elijah took a deep breath, his voice tense. I was arrested today. What? Ruth's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. They thought I was someone else, a robbery suspect. But that's not the worst part. Elijah's hands trembled as he continued. They ran my identification, and they found out something I never knew. Mom, why didn't you tell me who my father was? Ruth's face paled. She stepped back, gripping the edge of the table for support. Elijah, Why, Mom? Why didn't you tell me my father was a civil rights leader? Elijah's voice was louder now, the hurt and betrayal spilling out. I had a right to know. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. I was trying to protect you. From what? Elijah demanded. From knowing the truth? From knowing who I am? Ruth shook her head, her voice trembling. Your father was a great man, Elijah, but the world he fought against, it took him from us. I didn't want you to live with that burden. You didn't think I could handle it? Elijah asked, his heart heavy with frustration. I wanted you to have a life of your own, free from the dangers that came with your father's legacy, Ruth whispered. I didn't want you to be a target. Elijah stood there, torn between understanding her reasons and feeling the weight of betrayal. I needed to know, he said, his voice breaking. I needed to know who my father was. Ruth reached out for him, but Elijah stepped back, the walls between them higher than they'd ever been. He turned and left the house, his mind spinning with questions, each step away from his mother echoing with the painful truth she had kept hidden. Elijah couldn't stop the thoughts racing in his mind as he sat at the local library. The revelation about his father, Reverend Samuel Walker, a name that now felt both foreign and familiar, had shaken his world. He had no memory of the man, only fragments of stories Ruth had rarely spoken of, and now, he felt the weight of this discovery pressing down on him like a heavy fog. The dusty scent of old books filled the air as he sat at the large wooden table, surrounded by stacks of local newspapers from decades ago. He flipped through each page, scanning headlines, until finally, there it was. Reverend Walker leads protest in the heart of the South. The photograph that accompanied the article showed a tall, proud man standing at the head of a group, his fist raised in solidarity. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. This was his father. His eyes devoured the article. It detailed a peaceful protest led by Samuel to demand voting rights for black citizens in the 1960s. The text painted a picture of a man who was not just a local preacher but a powerful force for change. Words like courageous and determined jumped off the page. Reverend Walker was arrested after refusing to disperse, despite threats of violence from local authorities, the article read. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. His father had been arrested, not for a crime, but for standing up for what was right. Suddenly, the injustice of his own arrest felt connected to a much larger history, a history he had never known he was part of. He closed the newspaper, sitting in silence for a moment. There was so much more he didn't know. He needed to dig deeper. That evening, Elijah drove back to Ruth's house, the weight of his discovery still fresh in his mind. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the modest home he had grown up in. He hadn't told Ruth he was coming, but he couldn't wait any longer. He had too many questions. Ruth was in the kitchen, the soft clatter of dishes filling the room as Elijah stepped inside. She turned, surprised to see him. Elijah, she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. I didn't expect you back so soon. I've been to the library, Elijah said, skipping the pleasantries. His voice was calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. I found articles about Dad, about his work. Ruth's face softened with a mixture of sadness and understanding. She placed the dish towel down and motioned for him to sit at the table. Elijah, I know you're angry, she began gently, sitting across from him. I should have told you sooner. But I didn't want you to carry the same burdens your father did. Elijah shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. You kept this from me for my entire life. I had no idea who my father was, and now, I find out from a police officer? I deserve to know the truth, Mom. Ruth sighed, her eyes distant. Your father was a great man, but his work, it wasn't easy. There were threats, constant danger. He gave his life for the movement. I didn't want that for you, but don't you see? Elijah pressed, his voice rising slightly. You can't just erase that part of me. I feel like I've been living a lie. Ruth reached across the table and took Elijah's hand, her voice soft but firm. I wasn't trying to erase him, Elijah. I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you to feel the weight of his legacy. I wanted you to have a life free from fear. Elijah pulled his hand away, leaning back in his chair. But now that I know, I feel like I have to do something. I can't just ignore it. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. I know, and I'm so sorry, Elijah. I never wanted to burden you with this. Elijah stood, the conversation too heavy to continue. I need to figure this out for myself. Without another word, he left Ruth sitting at the table, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her son was stepping into the world she had tried so hard to shield him from. A few days later, Elijah stood outside a small, weathered church on the outskirts of town. Reverend Michael Martinez had agreed to meet him after Elijah reached out, curious to learn more about his father from someone who had known him personally. The church door creaked open, and an elderly man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes stepped out to greet him. "Elijah," Martinez said with a warm smile. "You look just like your father." Elijah swallowed hard, feeling a strange mix of pride and sadness. "I didn't know him," he admitted. "I didn't even know who he really was until recently." Martinez nodded, motioning for Elijah to follow him inside. The interior of the church was quiet and simple, with rows of worn wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast soft light over the altar. "Your father was a good man," Martinez said as they sat down, "but he carried a heavy burden. The fight for justice. It's never an easy one." Elijah leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What was he like?" Martinez's eyes softened. "He was passionate, driven. Samuel believed in the power of love to overcome hate. But that didn't mean he didn't face his share of challenges. There were threats, violence, even from those who claimed to be on his side. He never backed down, though. He believed that the work he was doing was too important." Elijah absorbed the Reverend's words, trying to reconcile the image of his father as a fierce leader with the quiet life he had always known. "I feel like I've been living in his shadow without even realizing it." Martinez placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You don't have to carry his burden, Elijah. Your father fought so that you wouldn't have to. But if you choose to take up his mantle, just know that it won't be easy." Elijah nodded, his mind racing. He had spent his life avoiding conflict, living peacefully in his small corner of the world. But now, he couldn't ignore the call of his father's legacy. He thanked Reverend Martinez and left the church, feeling the weight of the decision he would soon have to make. That night, Elijah sat in his living room, staring out the window at the darkened street. The weight of everything he had learned pressed down on him like a physical force. His father had been a hero, a man who had sacrificed everything for the fight against injustice. But Elijah wasn't sure he was made of the same stuff. He had always been content with his quiet life, teaching history, helping out at the community center, living under the radar. But now, the knowledge of his father's legacy gnawed at him, pulling him towards something bigger, something more dangerous. "Is this really my fight?" he whispered to himself. "Or am I just trying to live up to something I can never be?" His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Matt, one of the kids he mentored at the community center. "Thanks for all your help this week, Mr. Walker. You really make a difference." Elijah stared at the message, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had always taken pride in helping others, in making a difference in small ways. Maybe that was enough. Maybe he didn't have to be like his father, fighting on the front lines of a movement. But then again, maybe he did. The next day, Elijah stood in front of the Oakwood Community Center, watching as kids played basketball in the courtyard. The sound of laughter filled the air, and for a moment, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift. He had spent so much time grappling with his father's legacy, unsure if he could ever live up to it. But as he watched the kids he had grown to care for, he realized something important. His father's work had always been about more than just protests and speeches. It had been about community, about lifting people up and fighting for a better world. "Elijah," Matt called from the basketball court, waving him over. "Come join us." Elijah smiled and waved back, but instead of heading to the court, he turned and walked toward the center's main office. He had made his decision. Inside, he found Sarah, the center's director, typing away at her desk. She looked up and smiled as Elijah entered. "Elijah, what can I do for you?" "I want to do more," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I want to get more involved with the community, with everything." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "More involved? You already do so much around here." "I need to do more," Elijah insisted. "There are bigger issues that need to be addressed. I've been reading about my father, and I realize now that I can't just sit on the sidelines. I need to be part of the change." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, we could always use more help organizing events, especially ones focused on community outreach." Elijah smiled, feeling a sense of purpose settle over him. "I'm in. Whatever you need, I'm ready." As he left the office and rejoined the kids on the basketball court, Elijah felt lighter. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to take the first step, even if the path ahead was uncertain. Elijah stood outside the Oakwood Community Center, watching the kids play basketball on the worn-down court. It was noisy, filled with laughter and shouts of encouragement, and despite the uncertainty that had been gnawing at him since he discovered the truth about his father, this place made him feel grounded. For weeks now, he had been throwing himself into his volunteer work, mentoring at-risk youth. If his father fought for equality and justice, maybe Elijah could find his way by helping the next generation. "Hey, Mr. Walker," called Marcus, one of the teenagers Elijah had been working with. "You gonna jump in or what?" Elijah smiled, walking over to the court, his sneakers crunching against the concrete. "You know I'll beat you, right?" Marcus grinned, holding the ball out to Elijah. "We'll see about that." They played for a while, and Elijah felt a sense of purpose with each pass, each laugh shared. It wasn't activism on a grand scale like his father, but it was meaningful. These kids needed guidance, and Elijah was more than willing to provide it. After the game, Marcus sat on the sidelines, catching his breath. "You know, Mr. Walker, you're making a real difference here. Some of the guys are thinking about going to college, just because of what you've been telling them." Elijah felt a surge of pride. "That's great, Marcus. You can all make something of yourselves. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the kids dispersed, heading home as dusk began to settle, Elijah stood for a moment, watching them leave. They trusted him. Maybe, just maybe, this was how he could build something lasting. A week later, Elijah sat at the community center, going over some lesson plans for the kids, when there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Officer Mitchell Davis standing there, his uniform pristine, but his face strained. Elijah's gut tightened. He hadn't seen Davis since the day of his arrest. "Elijah, can I come in?" Davis asked, his voice soft. Elijah hesitated, but then nodded, gesturing for him to sit down. Davis entered slowly, sitting across from him at the table. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Davis began, his gaze locked on the table between them. "What we did to you. And I want to apologize." Elijah didn't reply immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. The anger and humiliation of that day still burned in his chest, even though weeks had passed. He had tried to push it down, to focus on the work he was doing at the center, but now it all came rushing back. "I appreciate that," Elijah finally said, his voice steady, though there was a heaviness to it. "But words aren't enough." "I know," Davis said quickly. "That's why I'm here. I want to make things right. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'd like to help if you'll let me." Elijah leaned back in his chair, studying the officer. "Help how?" "I've been talking to Officer Rodriguez," Davis explained. "We've both been thinking about how we can do better by the community. We want to be part of the solution, not the problem. I know it sounds cliché, but we want to work with you on something real." Elijah considered the offer. Part of him wanted to reject it outright, to tell Davis to leave and never come back. But another part of him, the part that felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him, saw an opportunity. "What exactly are you proposing?" Elijah asked, narrowing his eyes. Davis straightened up in his chair, his expression serious. "We could start by holding community meetings. Dialogue sessions where the police and residents can talk openly about their concerns. No uniforms. Just people, face to face." It was a step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. Elijah felt conflicted. Could he really work with the same officers who had wronged him? "I'll think about it," Elijah said. A few days later, Elijah called Officer Davis. After wrestling with his emotions, he had made his decision. "Let's meet," Elijah said, his voice firm. "You and Rodriguez. We'll talk about what comes next." The community center was quiet when the officers arrived, and Elijah greeted them at the door. Davis and Rodriguez both looked nervous, but there was a sincerity in their expressions that gave Elijah a sliver of hope. They sat down in the main room, the walls covered in colorful artwork created by the kids from the neighborhood. For a few moments, no one spoke. Finally, Rodriguez broke the silence. "We know that the relationship between the police and this community is strained. And after what happened to you, I understand if you don't want to work with us, but we really do want to change things. Elijah looked at her, then at Davis. You both know what needs to be done. This isn't just about dialogue. This is about action. Real change. Are you willing to put in the work? Davis nodded. Absolutely. Elijah leaned forward, clasping his hands together. Then let's start with a town hall. We need to get the whole community involved. They need to know this isn't just talk. Rodriguez smiled faintly. We're with you. As Elijah began organizing the town hall, working late nights at the community center to spread the word, his mother, Ruth, became more distant. One evening, as he sat in his living room, reviewing plans for the event, Ruth called. Elijah, she said, her voice tight with worry. I've been hearing about what you're planning. These meetings, these partnerships with the police. I'm scared for you. Elijah set his papers aside, his heart sinking. Mom, I'm not doing anything dangerous. We're just talking. Ruth sighed on the other end of the line. That's how it starts, Elijah. You think it's just words, but soon enough, you'll find yourself in the middle of something bigger than you can handle. That's what happened to your father. Elijah clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar frustration rising. Mom, I'm not Dad. I'm just trying to make things better. I know, Ruth whispered, but I don't want to lose you like I lost him. There was a long pause. Elijah understood her fear. He had grown up watching Ruth live with the grief of losing Samuel, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away from this. I'm being careful, Mom, Elijah said softly, but I can't stand by and do nothing. Ruth didn't reply immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a mix of resignation and love. Just promise me you'll be careful. I will, Elijah assured her. The night of the town hall meeting arrived, and the Oakwood Community Center was packed. People of all ages filled the room, some curious, others skeptical. At the front of the room, Elijah stood with Davis and Rodriguez, their presence a signal of the fragile alliance they were trying to build. Elijah cleared his throat, stepping up to the microphone. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. We're here tonight to start a conversation, to talk openly about the challenges we face as a community, and the role the police play in that. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but also a few skeptical glances. Elijah could feel the tension in the room. He pressed on. We all know things haven't been perfect, Elijah continued. But if we want change, we need to work together. That's why I've asked Officers Davis and Rodriguez to join us. They want to listen, to hear what you have to say. Davis stepped forward, his face serious. We're not here to defend what's happened in the past, he said, his voice filled with remorse. We're here to learn from it, and to figure out how we can do better. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a woman in the back raised her hand. What's going to change? She asked, her tone sharp. How can we trust you? Rodriguez stepped forward. I know trust has to be earned. We're committed to earning it, through our actions, not just our words. The meeting continued, with heated exchanges and moments of genuine connection. By the end of the night, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he believed that real change was possible. As the crowd began to disperse, Elijah stood by the door, thanking people for coming. One by one, they left, leaving him with the officers. Davis nodded at Elijah, his expression filled with gratitude. This is just the beginning. Elijah smiled, though he knew there were still many challenges ahead. Yeah, but it's a good start. Elijah sat at the old wooden desk in his small home office, surrounded by scattered papers, newspaper clippings, and books about the civil rights movement. The soft light from the lamp cast shadows on the documents, but his mind was elsewhere, racing with thoughts of his father. Elijah had been spending every spare moment digging into Samuel Walker's past, determined to learn more about the man who had shaped the world but had been kept a secret from him. He leaned forward, squinting at an old article from a 1965 edition of a local newspaper. The headline caught his attention, Leader of Movement Betrayed by Own. His heart skipped a beat as he read the details. His father's death wasn't the result of a random hate crime, as he'd always been led to believe. The article hinted at betrayal from within his father's own circle, members of the movement who had turned against Samuel out of fear or jealousy. What? Elijah whispered to himself, his hands trembling as he set the paper down. His pulse quickened, his chest tightening with disbelief and anger. He stared at the words, unable to fully comprehend the depth of the betrayal. This changed everything. Elijah had spent weeks grappling with his father's legacy, trying to reconcile the man he never knew with the ideals of justice and equality Samuel had fought for. But now, this revelation shook him to the core. The people who had stood by Samuel in his fight for justice had, in the end, turned against him. He couldn't sit still any longer. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them, Reverend Michael Martinez. The next morning, Elijah found himself standing in front of the small church where Reverend Martinez still held services. The building was old, its wooden steps creaking under Elijah's weight as he approached. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, betrayal, and anger. Inside, the familiar smell of old wood and candle wax greeted him. Reverend Martinez was at the front of the church, arranging hymnals when Elijah walked in. The elderly man looked up, his face softening into a smile as he recognized Elijah. Elijah, Martinez greeted warmly, his voice filled with the same kindness Elijah had come to expect from him. "It's good to see you, son. How are you?" But Elijah wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He held up the newspaper article, his hand shaking. "Did you know about this?" he demanded, his voice edged with anger. "Did you know that my father was betrayed by his own people?" Martinez's expression faltered, the smile slipping from his face as he took in the accusation. He sighed, setting down the hymnals and motioning for Elijah to sit, but Elijah remained standing, his body tense. "Please," Martinez said softly, "let me explain." Elijah crossed his arms, his jaw clenched. "I'm listening." Martinez sat down slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of years. "Your father, Samuel, was a great man, but he was also a threat to many, both outside and inside the movement. His ideals were uncompromising, and some of the people around him, they weren't as strong. There were those who feared the consequences of going too far, of pushing too hard." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. "So, they betrayed him?" Martinez nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "They did. There were whispers, meetings behind closed doors. People who were supposed to be allies turned their backs on him when it mattered most. They thought they were protecting the movement, but instead, they left Samuel exposed." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. "And you knew about this?" Martinez's gaze dropped to the floor. "I did," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Samuel was already gone." Elijah stepped back, feeling as though the ground had fallen out from beneath him. "You could have stopped it." Martinez looked up, pain etched across his face. "I should have, but I didn't. And I've lived with that regret every day since." Elijah turned, his mind racing, his heart heavy with the weight of the revelation. He couldn't bear to hear any more. "I need time to think," he muttered, his voice strained. Martinez watched him go, his expression filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Elijah," he called after him. "I truly am." But Elijah didn't respond. He left the church, his mind reeling. His father had been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to stand with him. The days that followed were a blur of disillusionment and isolation. Elijah withdrew from the community, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. He stopped going to the center, stopped attending meetings, and avoided the people he had been working with, including the officers who had become part of his efforts for change. The Oakwood Community Center, once filled with life and energy, felt different without Elijah's presence. The kids noticed, the staff noticed, and slowly, the momentum they had built began to fade. Elijah spent his days alone, avoiding calls from Sarah at the center and from Officer Davis, who had been trying to reach out. He felt lost, disconnected from everything that had once given him purpose. The idea of continuing his father's work seemed impossible now. How could he fight for justice when the very people who claimed to do the same had betrayed his father? One evening, Elijah sat in the darkness of his living room, the silence almost suffocating. He stared at the old newspaper article in his hands, the words blurring before his eyes. His father's legacy felt tainted now, stained by betrayal and deceit. He didn't know if he could carry that weight anymore. The following morning, there was a knock at Elijah's door. He didn't want to answer it, but after a few moments of persistent knocking, he finally opened it to find his mother, Ruth, standing on the porch. Her eyes were filled with concern. "Elijah," she said softly, stepping inside. "I've been worried about you. I haven't heard from you in days." Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been dealing with a lot." Ruth took his hand, leading him to the couch. She sat beside him, her gaze filled with understanding. "I know you've been struggling with what you learned about your father. I can see it weighing on you." Elijah's voice cracked as he spoke. How could they do that to him, Mom? How could his own people betray him? Ruth's eyes filled with tears as she reached out, taking his hand. "Elijah, I know it's hard to understand. Your father, he believed in people, even when they let him down. He knew the risks of the fight he was in, but he also believed it was worth it. I don't know if I can do this," Elijah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can live with that betrayal." Ruth squeezed his hand. "Your father wasn't perfect, and neither was the movement. But that doesn't mean the fight isn't worth it. You have a chance to make a difference, Elijah. Don't let the mistakes of the past stop you from doing what's right." Elijah looked at his mother, his heart aching. She had carried the weight of his father's legacy for so long, and now she was asking him to do the same. "I'm scared, Mom," he confessed, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can live up to him." Ruth smiled gently, brushing a tear from his cheek. "You don't have to live up to him. You just have to be yourself. Your father's legacy isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance." Her words settled over Elijah like a blanket, offering a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in weeks. Maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of his father's legacy alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his own way to honor it. The next day, Elijah found himself back at the Oakwood Community Center. The moment he stepped inside, the kids rushed toward him, their faces lighting up at the sight of him. "Mr. Walker, where have you been?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide with concern. Elijah smiled, though the weight of the past few weeks still lingered in his chest. "I've had a lot on my mind, Marcus, but I'm back now." The kids surrounded him, asking him questions and updating him on everything he had missed. As he listened to their voices, Elijah felt a sense of purpose returning. The weight of his father's legacy didn't feel as crushing now. Instead, it felt like a guiding force, something to strive toward, not to be burdened by. Later that afternoon, Elijah sat down with Sarah and the rest of the staff, ready to resume the work they had started. There was still so much to do, but for the first time in weeks, Elijah felt ready to face it. "We're glad you're back, Elijah," Sarah said with a smile. "We missed you." Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I missed this place too." As they began discussing the next steps for the community initiatives, Elijah felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just carrying his father's legacy anymore. He was building his own. Elijah stood outside the Oakwood Community Center, staring at the entrance as if it were the gateway to something bigger than he'd ever imagined. The kids had seen him return, their shouts of excitement carrying across the playground. Inside, volunteers bustled around, preparing for the after-school activities. Despite the warmth of the welcome he received, Elijah couldn't shake the lingering weight of his discovery about his father. As soon as he stepped through the doors, Marcus ran up to him. "Mr. Walker, you're back." Elijah smiled, though it felt forced. "Yeah, I'm back. How've you been?" "Good. We've been waiting for you. Miss Sarah said you had a lot on your mind." Sarah walked over, catching the tail end of their conversation. "Welcome back," she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. "You've been missed." Elijah nodded. "I had to clear my head, but I'm ready to get back to work." Marcus tugged on Elijah's arm. "You coming to the court later?" "I'll be there," Elijah promised. As the kids scattered, Elijah turned to Sarah. "I'm glad to be back, but things feel different now." Sarah studied him for a moment, then gestured for him to follow her to a quiet corner of the center. "What's going on, Elijah? I know you've been going through a lot." Elijah sighed. I found out something about my father, something that changes everything I thought I knew. Sarah waited patiently, sensing his hesitation. He was betrayed, Sarah, Elijah said, his voice tight. The people who were supposed to be his allies, they turned on him. I don't know if I can continue his work knowing that. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. Your father fought for justice, even when things were messy. Just because people failed him doesn't mean the cause wasn't worth fighting for. Elijah nodded slowly. You're right, but it's still hard to wrap my head around. It'll take time, she said gently, but I'm glad you're back. We need you here. Later that week, tensions between the community and the police began to rise again. A new incident involving excessive force had occurred just a few blocks from the center, and the anger simmering beneath the surface was threatening to boil over. Elijah found himself caught in the middle, trying to mediate between the community and the officers who had been part of the fragile alliance they'd begun to build. Elijah sat across from Officer Davis and Officer Rodriguez at the community center, the air thick with tension. Both officers looked weary, their faces tight with the stress of the situation. We're losing the community's trust, Elijah said, his voice strained. We were making progress, but it set us back. Davis rubbed his hands over his face. I know, it's a mess, but we're doing everything we can to address it. Everything? Elijah raised an eyebrow. Because from where the community stands, it looks like nothing has changed. Rodriguez leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. We're on your side, Elijah. We're trying to fix this from the inside, but it's not easy. The system is bigger than us, but that doesn't mean we're giving up. Elijah sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I get that, but the community doesn't see it that way. They want action, not words. Davis nodded. What do you need from us? Elijah hesitated, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. I don't know, but I know we can't keep going like this. We need to rebuild the trust we've lost, and that starts with accountability. Rodriguez glanced at Davis before speaking again. We're with you, Elijah. Whatever you decide to do, we'll back you up. Elijah appreciated their support, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to heal the rift that had grown between the community and the police. He needed to do something more. Frustrated by the slow pace of change, Elijah made a decision. He would organize a peaceful protest to demand accountability from the police and to show the community that their voices would be heard. He reached out to Davis and Rodriguez, urging them to join in solidarity. The day of the protest arrived, and the air buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and tension. A large crowd had gathered in front of the community center, holding signs and chanting for justice. Elijah stood at the front, his heart pounding as he prepared to address the crowd. Officer Davis and Officer Rodriguez stood to the side, visibly uncomfortable but determined to show their support. Elijah, are you sure about this? Davis asked, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. I have to be, Elijah replied. The community needs to see that we're serious about change. Davis nodded, though the uncertainty lingered in his expression. We're with you. As the crowd quieted, Elijah stepped forward, raising a hand to call for attention. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. We're here today because we believe in a better future, one where justice is truly for all of us, and where those in power are held accountable. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Elijah continued. But we can't do this alone. We need each other. We need to work together to demand the changes our community deserves. He glanced over at Davis and Rodriguez, who stood tall, though it was clear they felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on them. And that includes the police. We're not here to create division. We're here to build bridges. As the protest continued, the crowd's energy ebbed and flowed. Some people were skeptical of the officers' presence, while others welcomed the show of solidarity. Elijah knew it was just the beginning of a long road ahead, but for now, it was enough to see that people were willing to come together. As the protest wound down, Elijah found himself standing with Davis and Rodriguez once more. The officers had remained stoic throughout the event, but Elijah could sense the tension brewing beneath the surface. What's on your mind? Elijah asked, turning to Davis. Davis hesitated before answering. Do you really think we can make a difference? I mean, we're trying, but sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions." Rodriguez nodded, her voice quieter than usual. "We want change, Elijah, but it's hard to see how it'll ever happen. The system, it's not built for this." Elijah looked between the two officers, feeling the weight of their words. "I know it's hard. I've had my doubts too. But the truth is, real change doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small steps, with people like you who are willing to stand up and say enough is enough." Davis sighed. "But what if we're not enough?" Elijah placed a hand on Davis's shoulder. "You are. But you're not alone in this. We're all part of the solution. If we keep pushing, we can make a difference." Rodriguez smiled faintly. "Thanks, Elijah. We'll keep trying." Elijah nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but he was starting to believe that real change was possible, even if it came one small step at a time. As the sun began to set, the protest came to a peaceful end. People lingered, talking in small groups, sharing stories and ideas for how to move forward. Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the community came together in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. Sarah approached, her face glowing with pride. "You did it, Elijah. This was a success." Elijah smiled, though he knew the road ahead would be long. "It's just the beginning," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "But for the first time in a while, I feel hopeful." Sarah nodded. "So do I." As the crowd slowly dispersed, Elijah felt a sense of peace settle over him. The weight of his father's legacy still pressed on his shoulders, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a guiding light. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for now, he knew one thing. He was ready to continue the fight, not just for his father, but for his community and for himself. The Oakwood Community Center was more alive than Elijah had ever seen it. Banners celebrating the legacy of Reverend Samuel Walker lined the walls. Photographs of his father's civil rights marches, speeches, and moments of impact displayed prominently around the room. People from all walks of life filled the hall, from young activists to elderly members of the community who had once marched alongside Samuel. Elijah stood at the entrance, his mother Ruth by his side. She looked around the room, her eyes misty with emotion as she took in the sight of so many people gathered to honor her late husband. "Your father would have been so proud," Ruth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "I hope so." He scanned the crowd, feeling a mix of pride and anxiety. Today wasn't just about honoring Samuel. It was about reclaiming the legacy that had been hidden from him for so long. Elijah had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with Sarah and the community to make sure the event was both a tribute to his father and a symbol of hope for the future. As people mingled, Elijah noticed Reverend Michael Martinez standing near the stage. The elderly preacher caught his eye and gave him a small, somber nod. Elijah knew what was coming. They hadn't spoken since Elijah learned the truth about his father's death. Today, that would change. "I need to take care of something," Elijah told his mother. She gave him a reassuring smile as he walked toward Martinez. Martinez looked older than Elijah remembered. The weight of the years and the secrets he had carried seemed to hang heavily on him. As Elijah approached, the Reverend straightened, his face filled with regret. "Elijah," Martinez began, his voice low. "I owe you an apology." Elijah crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "You should have told me the truth, Reverend. You should have told me what happened to my father." Martinez lowered his gaze. "I know. I was a coward. I thought keeping the truth buried would protect the movement, protect your father's legacy. But in doing so, I betrayed your trust. I betrayed Samuel's memory." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elijah had spent weeks grappling with the anger, the betrayal. He had felt lost, unsure if he could ever forgive Martinez for his silence. But standing here, in the midst of the event honoring his father, surrounded by people who had come together to remember Samuel's life and work, Elijah realized something. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about building a future where healing was possible. "I've thought a lot about what you said," Elijah began, his voice steady, "about why you kept the truth from me. And as angry as I've been, I understand now that you were trying to do what you thought was best." Martinez looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. Elijah took a deep breath. I forgive you, Reverend. Martinez's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you, Elijah. You have no idea how much that means to me. Elijah nodded. But this isn't just about the past. It's about what comes next. My father's legacy isn't something I can carry alone, and it's not something that should be hidden in shame. We have to honor it by continuing the work he started. Martinez smiled, the weight of years seeming to lift from his frame. I couldn't agree more. And I'm here to help, in whatever way I can. As they stood together in the crowded room, the tension between them finally began to dissolve. The past had been painful, but forgiveness had made room for something new. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin and the memorial event drew to a close, Elijah and Ruth found a quiet moment to sit together. They had spent the entire day surrounded by people honoring Samuel, sharing stories of his life and his fight for justice. But now, it was just the two of them. Ruth reached over and took Elijah's hand, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. You did it, Elijah. You brought your father's memory back to life. Elijah squeezed her hand gently. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You kept him alive in your own way, even if I didn't know it. Ruth's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I'm sorry, Elijah. I'm sorry for not telling you sooner. I wanted to protect you, but I see now that keeping the truth from you only caused more pain. Elijah shook his head, his voice soft. I understand why you did it. You were trying to protect me from the same dangers that took Dad from us. Ruth looked away, her voice trembling. I didn't want you to have to carry the same burdens he did. I didn't want you to live in fear. I know, Elijah said, his heart aching. But I'm not afraid, Mom. Not anymore. Ruth's gaze returned to his, her expression filled with emotion. I'm proud of you, Elijah. I always have been. But today, I know your father would be proud too. Elijah felt a lump in his throat. I hope so. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history settling around them. For so long, Ruth had carried the burden of Samuel's legacy alone, but now Elijah was ready to take it on with her. Thank you, Elijah said quietly. For everything. Ruth smiled through her tears. You're welcome, my son. As the evening approached its final moments, Elijah found himself standing in front of the stage, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to honor his father. The energy in the room had shifted. There was a sense of hope, of possibility, in the air. Elijah took a deep breath, stepping up to the microphone. Thank you all for being here today, Elijah began, his voice steady. This memorial is more than just a celebration of my father's life. It's a reminder of the work that still needs to be done, of the legacy we all carry forward. He paused, scanning the room. Faces looked back at him. Friends, neighbors, activists, police officers, each one a part of the fabric of their community. My father, Reverend Samuel Walker, believed in justice, in equality, and in the power of community, Elijah continued. He gave everything to that cause, knowing that change doesn't come easily. And now, I stand before you, humbled by his legacy and inspired to continue his work. The crowd listened intently, their eyes fixed on Elijah. I've learned a lot about my father in the past few months, Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. I've learned that he wasn't perfect, and neither was the movement he was a part of. But the imperfections don't diminish the importance of the fight. They remind us that we're all human, that we're all trying to do better. He took a deep breath, his voice steadying. The fight for justice didn't end with my father's death. It's still happening today, in this community, in this country. And it's up to us to keep pushing forward, to keep standing up for what's right. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Elijah smiled softly. My father's legacy isn't just mine to carry. It belongs to all of us. And together, I know we can make a difference. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the room with energy and hope. Elijah stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace with his father's legacy. He wasn't walking in Samuel's shadow anymore. He was forging his own path, one that honored the past while looking toward the future. After the memorial, Elijah stood outside the community center, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but a few people lingered, talking quietly as they made their way home. Elijah watched them go, a sense of calm settling over him. Sarah walked up beside him, her face glowing with pride. "You did it, Elijah. That was an incredible speech." Elijah smiled, though it was a small, quiet smile. "Thank you. I just hope it makes a difference." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "It already has." Elijah looked out at the neighborhood, the streets he had walked for years, the faces he had come to know so well. This was his community, his home, and now it was also the place where he had reclaimed his father's legacy. "I know the road ahead won't be easy," Elijah said softly, "but I'm ready for it." Sarah nodded. "You're not alone, Elijah. We're all in this together." Elijah turned to her, a sense of peace washing over him. "I know." As they stood together, watching the last of the crowd fade into the night, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past had been painful, but it had also given him the strength to face the future. With his father's legacy in his heart and his community by his side, Elijah was ready to continue the fight for justice, for equality, and for a better tomorrow.